Seminars at Steamboat. I'm Joella West, Seminars Chair. Thank you all for joining us, whether in Steamboat or from afar. The Seminars at Steamboat season has always been short, like summer itself here in the Rocky Mountains. And believe it or not, we're approaching the end. 1 week from today, we'll present our last talk of 2020. So if you have friends who haven't yet discovered us, please encourage them to log in and participate now and again next Monday. We hope that you created your own post-talk small gatherings. Depending on your time zone, it might be a socially distanced dinner at a local restaurant or a Zoom nightcap and conversation. This is a particularly challenging year for every nonprofit organization. We recognize our good fortune to have the financial support of so many donors. You help make it possible for us to continue presenting our talks free to the public, which is an integral part of our mission. If you decide that you would like to make a contribution during this talk, or really at any time, you can do so very easily by going to our website, seminarsatspeedboat.org/donate. Special thanks to tonight's sponsors, Sleeping Giant Financial and the City of Steamboat Springs. As many of you know, our local independent bookseller, Off the Beaten Path, has traditionally made signed copies of our speakers' latest books available at the conclusion of their talk. That tradition continues this season, but like everything else, it's going online. You can order a copy of tonight's speaker's most recent book at steamboatbooks.com, and they will insert a signed book plate with your purchase. Previous talks from this season can be viewed again by going to Crowdcast Seminars at Steamboat. You can listen to this season's talks at kunc.org/seminars. You can also watch events from this and past seminars seasons on our website, seminarsatssteamboat.org. As you listen today, you can submit any questions for the speaker by clicking on the button at the bottom of your screen. Our speaker today is Dr. Sandra Postel. Here to introduce her is board member Walt Gabbard.
Good evening, and a warm welcome to the fourth presentation in this summer's seminar series. I'm Walt Gabbard, a Seminars board member, and I am delighted to moderate this evening's event. But before getting any further along, I'd like to take a moment to give a very quick shout out to two fellow board members, Katie Kochik and Alan Kirkpatrick, who helped make this evening's presentation possible. And so it is my privilege to introduce our speaker, Sandra Postel, who will inform and enlighten us on a topic that is critical to so many of us in so many different ways. Sandra Postel has had a distinguished career researching and communicating water issues in a variety of applications and putting them into practice. She received the Bachelor of Arts degree in Geology and Political Science from Wittenberg University in Ohio, and went on to earn a Master of Engineering Management degree from Duke. And she also received an Honorary Doctor of Science degree from the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. Sandra Postel is co-founder and director of the independent Global Water Policy Project. In 2010, she was appointed Freshwater Fellow at the National Geographic Society, and she serves as their lead freshwater expert. Sandra is also a Pew Scholar in Conservation and the Environment, and in 2002, she was named one of the Scientific American 50, an award that recognizes outstanding contributions in the areas of science and technology. She's also author of 8 books on freshwater issues, including Replenish, The Virtuous Cycle of Water and Prosperity, which is her latest book. And as Joella mentioned, it is available with a personally signed book plate from Steamboat's great and not so little bookstore, Off the Beaten Path. Simply go to the bookstore or visit them online at steamboatbooks.com. To say that Sandra Postel is passionate about freshwater is an understatement. Let's give a loud and warm virtual welcome to Sandra, and be sure to submit your questions using the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen, where you can also vote for your favorite question. And so now I'd like to turn the floor over to Sandra Postel.
Thank you, Walt, for that very kind and generous introduction. I'm so thrilled to be here tonight. It's a great pleasure, a great honor to be part of the Steamboat seminar series this summer. Certainly there'd be no better place to talk about freshwater than in the beautiful Yampa River Valley. But I have to say, I'm very grateful that we can gather this way, and really want to thank everyone associated with the seminars at Steamboat, to everyone that's made this possible, and a big thank you for that. I know it's not an easy job. I also want to give a thanks to Ken Spruill, who's going to be moving the slides for me. So that's a nice thing I don't have to do in this COVID type of presentation. So I'm grateful to Ken for moving things along for me. I'm going to talk about our global water challenges and emphasize our national challenges. And certainly when we get to solutions, talk more about what we can do here at home. And they're big challenges and they're serious challenges. But I wrote my latest book, Replenish, from the point of view of what I would call realistic optimism. Our water challenges, as you'll see, are tough. But when I look out into the world and look for ways we can solve these problems, they're out there. They're real, they're happening on the ground. And so I am optimistic that if we choose to, and we put our energy and minds and skill sets together, we can solve the problems I'm going to talk about. And please bear with me in the beginning. It'll be kind of heavy, the problems are big, but I wanted to sketch out the kinds of challenges we have, and then spend hopefully the better part of the discussion on those solutions and what we can do about it. And I want to say one other quick thing. The solutions that I talk about can happen. They are out there, but I do not believe that they will be sufficient to solve our water problems unless we take seriously and act very soon on the science that says we need to keep our global heating of the planet to 2 degrees Celsius, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is what the climate scientists tell us is necessary in order to keep climate change threats at a level we can really adapt to and have a prosperous society around. So water and climate, as we'll see, are very intertwined. So unless we deal with the climate issue, we're going to have a very hard time dealing with any of these water issues that I'm talking about. So please keep that in mind too. There's a big sort of caveat, okay, in the solutions. So with that, let's dive in. Ken, if you could move us to the first slide, that would be great. Many of you probably remember this photo. I certainly do. It was taken in 1968 by the Apollo 8 astronauts, and it gave us our first view of Earth from space. And it was a remarkable photograph for those of us who had never, all of us, none of us had never seen Earth from space. And what it showed us is that, yes, we're finite, but how remarkably blue, right, this planet is, especially juxtaposed against the barren landscape of the moon, which you can see right there as well. But it's very important to remember, right, that less than 1% of all of this beautiful blue water is actually fresh water, fresh enough to drink, fresh enough to grow crops with, and accessible to us, water we can access. Okay, most of it is seawater, and even most of the fresh water is locked up in ice and glaciers. So a very, very tiny share is actually fresh and accessible. And keep in mind that that water is finite, right? We talk about a water cycle, but it's a finite cycle. Yeah, the rain comes every year, so it's renewed by the cycle, but it's finite, okay? And our demands for water have not been finite. So we've been bumping up against some of these limits. So we see in the next slide what this means in terms of global depletion of water. And we might want to go to the full. Yeah, that's great, Ken. Thank you. So this is a map that was part of an article I worked on and published with a number of colleagues a few years ago. And it shows where the big areas of water depletion are on the planet today. And this is a bit of a finer look than maybe had been given before, because it gives you sort of the annual look, the seasonal look, and where this is just happening in dry years. And I can tell you that having worked on water issues for 40 years, this map has been getting redder and redder with each passing year. And again, that's because water's finite, our demands for water are not. So pay attention to where the red areas are on this map. When you see the deep red, look in the central part of the country. That's the Ogallala Aquifer, one of the biggest aquifers on the planet. And it's being steadily depleted by farming, by agriculture. Look at the California Central Valley, fruit and vegetable and nut bowl for this country. And it's in red. The groundwater is being depleted. Look at the Nile River Basin in Africa. Look at the Indus River Basin in Pakistan. Look at India, the Ganges. Look at the Yellow River in China. These are the world's major food producing areas, okay? And it's very, very disconcerting that they're all in red, in many areas deep red. When you add up what's happening here, at least 10% of the food we're producing today depends on the unsustainable use of water, the overpumping of groundwater primarily. And that's a bubble in the food economy that we're going to have to reckon with at some point. By definition, you can't keep doing something that's unsustainable forever. You're going to have to figure out how to get into that sustainable space. And so this red area is growing, and what we see are rivers running dry, groundwater getting depleted. Those are the physical manifestations. Cities like Jakarta literally sinking from the overpumping of groundwater, Mexico City literally sinking, and then food production very much at risk, okay? So sort of keep this map a little bit in your mind if you can as we think about these challenges. I also didn't mention the Murray River there in southeastern Australia, kind of the lifeline. So it's a nice global picture of at least the water depletion challenge, right, that we're facing. A lot of irrigated agriculture, nearly half of large cities experiencing at least periodic water shortage. Ken, if you could go to the next one, that would be great. So let's look at this infrastructure we have in place and what's actually going on with the water cycle. So when you look around the world, as scientists have done, and look at the numbers, globally, large dams are now disrupting about 48% of the volume of river flows. The dam that you see here is Hoover Dam, one of the most iconic dams in the world, and the first of the big super dams that were created in the world. The engineering hadn't been there really until Hoover Dam to build something this large that was capable of blocking so much of a river and storing so much water. Now, of course, we know that these big dams are generating a lot of important benefits for us, right? Controlling floods, providing drinking water, irrigation water, storing water from wet seasons to dry seasons, hydropower. Very, very important benefits. From a water cycle standpoint, though, they're causing a lot of harm, right? Because fish can't migrate upstream to spawning areas. Look at that dam. Imagine being a fish and trying to get beyond there. The rivers are not able to really fulfill their destiny of reaching the sea. You're blocking the dams from bringing sediment and nutrients down to the sea. And that's a major, major part of the water cycle. So all of the life in the river is no longer getting the natural flows of the river that they need for their habitat, for their food, to complete their life cycle. So keep in mind this issue. We've come to rely so much on these big dams. We've been creating, if you do the math over 60 years, we've been building about 2 big dams a day, every day around the world for 60 years. Big disruption in the hydrologic cycle, but a lot of benefits to the economy, okay? If we look at the next slide, we see the same sort of thing happening with wetlands. Wetlands are hard to kind of love unless you're a real birder, but they do incredible services. And I put that in quotes because it's a very sort of economic term for us. Look at all the things that wetlands do. They naturally remove nitrogen and phosphorus, and those are pollutants that are going into our rivers and streams, largely from farmland. They regulate floods because they're like sponges, right? They absorb water and then hold it and then release it gradually. Incredibly important for bird and wildlife habitat, fisheries, sequestering carbon, so helping mitigate climate change, storing water, as I said, so that you're mitigating floods and droughts at the same time. So tremendous benefits, and yet, what do we say a wetland is worth? We don't have a market value for it. And so we've tended to drain them, dredge them out, fill them, and put in whatever we need, shopping malls, housing developments, whatever, farmland, of course. So up to 50% of the world's wetlands are gone. And with them, all of these important services that really only now are we beginning to understand have incredible value. And yet half of them are already gone, okay? Next slide. So not surprising when you think about the dams, when you think about the wetlands, when you think about all of the infrastructure that's going into our natural water systems, freshwater life isn't doing well. It's disappearing. This statistic kind of blows me away. This came out in the Living Planet Index in, I believe it was the fall of 2019. Since 1970, the average abundance of freshwater vertebrate populations, so fish, frogs, salamanders, around the world has declined 83%. So think about that. Compared with 50 years ago, if we had, for example, 100 fish and frogs in 50 years ago in 1970, now there's only 17. For every 100, there's now only 17. That's a huge loss of life, and makes me wonder a bit how these ecosystems are even functioning with so much less life doing the work of nature. And maybe we're at more tipping points than we've visually seen. If we go to the next slide, another big issue that some of you may be familiar with in a personal way is the rise in toxic algal blooms around the world and across the United States. Largely, these come from an influx of nitrogen and phosphorus. These are pollutants, but they're also nutrients, right? These are what farmers put on fields to help their crops grow. But once they get into local water bodies and travel to a lake, travel to the sea, to a coastal estuary, for example, they cause algal blooms. They cause algal production to increase, and blooms can break out. And some of them can be toxic. We call them harmful algal blooms. Some of you may remember back in 2014, it was all over the news in the summer that a toxic algal bloom had positioned itself right over the drinking water intake for Toledo, Ohio. Toledo depends on the western part of Lake Erie for its water supply, its drinking water supply, and this toxic bloom situated itself right over that drinking water intake. And so Toledo had to basically shut down its water supply, its drinking water, and tell its customers, tell its residents in the city, don't drink the water, don't give that water to your pets, it's toxic. And so what's in there is this bacteria called microcystin. It's a toxic organism that can be very, very dangerous to human health, very, very detrimental to fisheries. In fact, the Pentagon has classified it as, potentially a biological weapon of warfare, if it could be weaponized to become that. So it's a very, very dangerous substance, and it's breaking out in these algal blooms. Not every algal bloom has them, but many of them do. Coastal Florida has had to shut down as well and declare states of emergency along the coast of Florida, the Atlantic coast of Florida. Because of these algal blooms. So these are rising in problems and a big concern. Next slide, please. So climate change, these things are happening anyway, right? But climate change is going to worsen all of these trends. Everything we've just been talking about is going to get worse as a result of the global warming of the planet, the heating of the planet. Back in 2008, a group of scientists, very esteemed scientists from around the world, published a paper in the journal Science that was titled "Stationarity is Dead." And what they meant by that is, yes, there's natural variability in our weather. There's natural variability in our water cycle, floods, droughts. But typically, if you look over the course of, say, a century of data, those trends are within knowable boundaries. You're going to have variation, but it's usually not higher than this, not lower than this. And what they're saying is that's no longer true. That no longer applies. We're outside the envelope. Stationarity is dead. And so from a water planning perspective, that's really challenging. Is that levee going to hold if the floods are going to get worse? Is that dam going to be sufficient for storing water? Is there not going to be enough water to fill that dam again, to fill that reservoir again? And these questions are arising all around the world. And we're seeing that climate change is affecting the risk around water and affecting the probability of things happening. The probability of longer and more severe droughts is increasing. The probability of more intense rainfall and more intense flooding, both urban and non-urban, is increasing. We're seeing the intensity of wildfires rising and the number of wildfires rising. So climate change is a big player in everything we're talking about. All of these issues exist anyway, but they're getting exacerbated, okay, by climate change. So if we go to the next slide, and this is where I want us to see, from an economic standpoint, this is really a big deal. 2017 gave the United States a look at what the economic cost of climate and weather-related disasters could look like. All those lines at the bottom are sort of, hovering there. Those are sort of more the average for this period of time, 1980 to 2017. But in 2017, we had Hurricanes Harvey in Texas, Irma in Puerto Rico, Maria in Florida. We had those were the three big weather disasters, weather and climate disasters. We had wildfires in California and other parts of the West, and then a smattering of droughts and tornadoes and hailstorms and things like that. So $306 billion, way out of line with what the average had been. So right now, this looks like an aberration, and it is. But climate scientists in the latest National Climate Assessment say that this is the kind of number we could expect to see much more of, at least by the end of the century. So these numbers are going to be increasing as we move forward. So preparing for these kinds of incidents, understanding that severe droughts and severe floods and wildfires are going to be generating these kinds of challenges is really important for how we go forward. And so in the next slide, I raised this question for us to consider, and it comes from a smart guy, Einstein, who said, we cannot solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. And that's a hard lesson to learn. And it's been a hard lesson to learn in water. When we run out of, when we have a city or a region starting to run out of water, the tendency is to go out and get more water. Find another river to divert, build a bigger dam further away, and get water somehow to where you need it. That's been the typical response as we begin to run into shortage. But what Einstein is saying is we cannot solve the problems I've just been laying out with the same kind of thinking that we used when we created them. And if you think about what that thinking has been, it's really been about controlling the water cycle, right? Using the best of our engineering to control the water cycle, bring water to where it's needed, to maximize economic benefits and advance social development. Not a bad goal at all, right? Very good goal, in fact. I have trouble imagining our world of nearly 8 billion people, $80 trillion in economic goods and services being exchanged. How can you even imagine a world like that? Much less cities in the desert like Phoenix and Tucson and Los Angeles and Las Vegas, without all this water engineering, without controlling the water cycle. It's hard to imagine that. But what he's saying is, going forward, all of these problems that we're seeing that have come about in part because of that, and then climate change on top of that, require that we think differently. And I believe, and this is what I write a lot about in Replenish, is that we need to replenish and repair the water cycle and figure out how to remain prosperous in doing that. We need to figure out how to work with nature and with the water cycle rather than continuing to try to manipulate it, control it as much as we do now. So I think what we're looking at is something we might call kind of an eco-engineering approach. And there's a field developing in this area now, sort of called eco-engineering, where we bring ecosystem concerns and engineering solutions together to come up with more optimal solutions that take the ecosystems and the values they provide for us into account. So let me give you a few examples, right, of these kinds of solutions and things we can do to replenish and repair the water cycle while still having prosperity. So Ken, the next slide. First off, what about some dams that we don't need anymore coming down? The strategic removal of dams. It looks like you can't see that number, but we have taken down a lot of dams over the last 30 years in particular. 20, 30 years, the last 20, 30 years have been sort of an era where we realized some of these dams are unsafe, some of them are obsolete, some of them are causing more harm than they are good. So we've started to take them down. Now, most of them are small dams, but not all of them. This is the Glines Canyon Dam on the Elwha River in Washington State. And it's a fairly sizable dam, came down some years back. And if you look at the next slide, after that dam came down, the river began to reclaim its channel. This was the reservoir that was created by the dam. And that river is now reclaiming its channel. And if you go to the next slide, what scientists found is that within a few months of the removal of the dam, they were beginning to see spawning Chinook salmon come back. In fact, 4,000 of them were back above that former dam site. These are threatened and endangered fisheries. And so the ability to have them come back was extremely encouraging, that if we can begin to give rivers room to flow again, let them flow again, they will heal and life will come back. And that's a powerful narrative, right? That give them a chance, rivers can heal and life can come back. So what seems to be gone may not be gone forever if we do that work of giving rivers room to flow. In the next slide, we can see another possibility of managing these dams differently. This is a picture or a map of where all the federal dams are in the United States. So this is, these are dams managed by the Army Corps of Engineers for flood controls, for example, the US Bureau of Reclamation for irrigation and water supply, and so on. A lot of dams, federal dams around the country. And at the time they were built, we weren't really concerned about the health of the water cycle, about the health of ecosystems. We were more concerned about flood control, hydropower, water supply, irrigation, and recreation to some degree, but not so much about the health of the river itself. So what if we went back, and asked at these dams, could we give some water back to the river at the right time, in the right amount, at a good enough quality, that habitat would come back and life would come back? And so it's an important question. The Nature Conservancy and the Army Corps of Engineers partnered around this question and did some pilot efforts in maybe a dozen or 20 of these dams, and found that in many cases, you can have improvements in the health of the river, the biodiversity of the river, the life in the river, without without any detrimental impacts on the purposes for which the dam was built, water supply, energy, so on. So there was an interesting example of this that had a lot of meaning for me. If we go to the next slide, Ken, where in 2012, the US and Mexico signed an agreement and did something pretty extraordinary. It was quite unique from an international water standpoint, where two countries that were in the midst of a drought. 2012 was a drought, and it was part of the extended drought the Colorado River Basin has been in. And they signed an agreement that did a number of things. And one of the things it did was give some water through an experiment back to the river. And it was interesting from a science standpoint and from a policy standpoint, because it tried to mimic the natural flow of the Colorado River before Hoover Dam was there, before all of the dams were there, when the snow melt that would happen in the spring, when the Colorado Rocky Mountain snowpack would melt and would flood into the Colorado Basin, all that water was not blocked by a dam. It would flow down toward the delta and then out to the sea, right? That never happens anymore. In fact, the Colorado River dries up at the US-Mexico border. There is virtually no water in most years flowing into its delta. Now remember, the delta of the Colorado River used to be a 2 million acre, beautiful, lush wetland, right? Incredibly beautiful. Aldo Leopold, who the great conservationist, canoed there and talked about 100 green lagoons and a land of milk and honey. But this is what you get now. But in 2012, the US and Mexico said, let's see what happens if we give the river give the delta a pulse of water. And so, Ken, we're going to go kind of quickly through the next four, and I'll just show you some pictures. I was there with a team from National Geographic, and I have to say it was one of the highlights of my professional life to just witness this. This is the last dam on the Colorado River. It's right at the border. It's called the Morelos Dam. And on a Sunday morning, March 23rd, 2014, the gates were opened. And the river that usually is diverted into canals at this point to supply Mexico's portion of the river flooded into the delta. And within, you can take the next picture, within a very short time, the river started to come into the delta. That's me in the blue shirt taking notes. And we would go out every morning and ask, where's the river going to be today? It was just slowly, almost like a mirage, coming down and reclaiming its channels. About a week later, as you'll see in the next slide, the river was just bank to bank. I mean, it hadn't been like this in a very long time. And a lot of us were there to focus on the science. And we're so, I guess, taken by and surprised by and moved by, it was a very moving thing, to see the people of San Luis Rio, Colorado, a delta town in Mexico, welcome their river back. They hadn't seen it. These kids had never seen the river that gave their town its name. And there were parties and picnics and music and barbecues and swimming and boating, and everybody was enjoying the river. And yet it was sort of sad because this was an experiment, right? It was going to go away. But for the meantime, there was this incredible celebration of the river. If we take the next slide, it took about 8 weeks. This is a shot from the air. It took about 8 weeks, but the river, a little bit of it did reach the sea. And I think it was more, what's the word I'm looking for? More symbolic than it was ecologically meaningful, because there was so little water that it didn't really restore the freshwater, saltwater connection there. But it showed everybody that we could do this. If we made a choice to give some water back to the river, we could do it. It would reach the sea if we chose to. And it was a tiny bit of water, but it showed we have a choice. And if we choose to do this, we can do it. The restoration, as we'll see in the next slide, is continuing. This was sort of the news breaking moment, but a lot of work continues in the Colorado Delta, trying to restore habitat. I failed to mention when I introduced this project that, the Colorado Delta was and now is becoming again a major stopover for migratory birds on the Pacific Flyway. You know, birds that are flying from South America all the way up to the Arctic would stop in this beautiful wetland and rest and feed and breed, and very important stopping ground. So conservationists have been working now for the better part of a couple decades, mostly within the last 10, and continuing to build these sort of stepping stones of habitat where birds and wildlife can thrive. Largely, you know, cottonwoods and willows and mesquite, the native vegetation. And it's a very inspiring, it's a lot of work. It's not inexpensive to do this. And this is largely taking water that farmers no longer need or are willing to donate and giving it back to nature, giving it to the ecosystem. So it's a great story, and I have a whole chapter on this in my book. It was such a fascinating story for me to be able to see a bit of and tell about. So there's more of it in there. So if we go on to the next slide, Ken, I'm going to pick it up a little bit here. What time is it? We can also get smarter about how we use and manage water. And a great example of that is a river right there in the Colorado River Basin, the Verde River, which, like many rivers in the West, had much of its water diverted from it and put into irrigation canals, irrigation ditches. And so in the summer, the river would often have no water in it. 5, 6, 7, 8 miles, virtually no water. Very bad for birds, very bad for fish. And this is one of the remaining desert rivers. There are just a small handful that have really good, you know, habitat for birds and wildlife right alongside them. And so conservationists have begun to work with irrigators in the valley to come up with a different way of using and managing the water. If we go to the next slide, this is not rocket science, but it's a technology that has made a difference. It's a head gate, solar powered, that allows the irrigators to take just the water they need from the river and leave the rest for the river. They don't need to divert all the river if they can measure and monitor what's going into their irrigation channels. And so this ditch boss, you know, is able to monitor this head gate from an iPhone, you know, from his living room. You know, it's a smart way of managing water and has allowed the river to actually, in some places, have twice the flow in it than it had before. And that spawned, as we see in the next slide, more activity. Here's a young farmer named Zach Hauser. He has shifted from flood to drip irrigation, more efficient irrigation, allowing more water to stay in the river. If we go to the next slide, here's an entrepreneur who realized, wow, you know, alfalfa uses a lot of water. What if we incentivize some farmers to grow barley by building a barley malt plant right there in the valley, create a market for the barley, which uses less water, and it doesn't need it in the summer. It's harvested more in the spring. So it's not taxing the river as much during the summer. And then it's supplying barley malt to the craft brewing industry in Arizona. And so the point of this is you can have healthy rivers and healthy agriculture and a vibrant economy side by side. If you look at the next slide, it's really a triple win in this regard. I don't see any downsides to this, but I want to say this very clearly. Western water policy does not incentivize this, right? There were conservationists had to raise money from federal agencies, from corporate entities that saw this as a good act of corporate water stewardship to put in those technologies. The farmers themselves don't really have any good incentive to do this from existing policy. It's use it or lose it, first in time, first in right. You don't want to really mess with your water right? So very hard to get this kind of a project done. And so again, it's where policy is so needed to scale up these kinds of solutions. The next slide. I'll be quick on this one, and I'll just say that as someone who's worked on water for 40 years, it was kind of shocking to me that I myself had not realized the importance of the soil as a critical part of the water cycle. Globally, soils can hold 8 times more water than all the world's rivers combined. And yet industrial agriculture has caused that reservoir to shrink, right? And so there's a big movement now to create better soil, to improve soil health, not just, because of increased yield and reduced need for fertilizer, but also for water storage in order to, capture and hold more water in that soil. If we go to the next slide, one of the ways that farmers are doing this is planting more cover crops. Instead of leaving the land barren during the winter, plant some cover crops in order to keep a living root in the soil. And you get benefits that are huge: flood mitigation, drought mitigation, less fertilizer use, and so on. But in the U.S., across the country, only 6% of farmland is getting, this kind of treatment. But when you have an incentive, as the state of Maryland does, that number goes way up. So again, it shows the need for incentives to scale up these policies. Most of our farm policies now are doing more environmental harm than good, which I think is not, a great use of taxpayer money. We need to really look at how we can build those incentives into the farm programs. The next slide. I'm going to skip over this. I'm looking at the time, and I think a lot of us know about the importance of fire, but I want to make sure we have time for questions. And so I'm going to flip through the next, I think 2 or 3, Ken, and we can come back to fire if it's important. Yeah, next one. We can come back to that if anyone has a question about it. But I wanted to get to this too before we go to questions. This is the Yampa River, which many of you know and love in a very personal way. And I wanted to give you this example because it's a really good one of how, state water policy can impact a river. Some of you may remember, if we go to the next slide, in 2012, there was a terrible drought. And the Yampa River, as you can see there, was crashing, literally crashing in late June. There's a native whitefish population, of course, fishing, fly fishing, and boating, various kinds, kayaking, rafting, all that shut down because the river got so low. So it was bad for the economy, bad for the river. But the Colorado Water Trust put out a call for anybody that might be able to lease water. And it was able to do that because the state of Colorado had put in place a law that had never been tried. This was the first time it was tried to basically lease water from a water rights holder that didn't need its full allotment of water. And it turned out that the Upper Yampa Conservancy District didn't need all of its water that year. And so the Colorado Water Trust leased it. The program I was in at National Geographic contributed some financing to this project to help make it happen. And the river started to come up. And then the rains came in July. And so it reached a level where all of that economic activity could open up again. The fly fishing, the rafting, the native whitefish population was much less damaged than it would have been potentially. And so it was very important. And the other thing I want to show before we move off this slide is that this graph of the river flow gives you a sense of what we might expect with climate change. That the historic flow of the river is that dotted line, right, over the last century. That's the way the Yampa River flowed. Much, much bigger peak, much more water overall, and the big peak coming later, right? Now we have a much earlier peak, much lower peak overall. And we might want to think about how this impacts, right? What this river is going to look like moving into the future. If we go to the next slide, I might skip over a couple more. I do want to mention this. This gets to how we use water at home. Now, if we go back one, Ken, I just want to mention this real quick. Back one slide. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, the conserve slide. One forward. Yeah, thank you, right there. And this is something to be proud about in this country, that our domestic water use has gone down 18% between 2000 and 2015. We don't have the data to update this yet. And the reason this happened, and this is where we get to important policy, is that in 1993, at the tail end of the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, the Energy Policy Act was signed, which included water efficiency standards for toilets and faucets and shower heads. It's, when I was a kid, it took 5 gallons of water to flush the toilet, right? Now you can't buy a toilet that flushes with more than 1.6 gallons. And so it built conservation into our homes, our offices, and our schools, and all of this infrastructure. So without any change in behavior on our part, water use was coming down in our homes, and that's made a big difference. And we also started a program at the EPA. EPA started a program called the Water Sense program, which is a labeling program that helps you pick out an appliance that's water efficient. So that's really, really helpful, right, in times of drought. Really, really helpful to save water. And so when you add up all these benefits, 9 billion gallons of water being saved every day, 9 billion with a B, because of this, and really no change on our parts at all. And so that's a really great example of progressive policy encouraging conservation and making a real difference. That's water that doesn't have to be pulled out of a river or a wetland. I think I should stop because I'm looking, if I'm seeing the time right, we really want to have time for questions. So if we just go to the last slide, Ken, I'm going to end with this slide. We're in this moment of a pandemic, and our economy has been really battered. Millions of people out of work. And I wrote this piece, which was published in a publication called The Hill a few weeks ago. Actually, it's back in April, I believe. And it basically called for what I termed a climate preparedness corps, kind of modeled after the Civilian Conservation Corps that helped us get out of the Great Depression. So think about all the types of projects I just laid out and creating millions of jobs, helping lift the economy out of this recession we're in and going to be in, and building water security at the same time, and preparing ourselves for these disruptive impacts that will be coming down the pike pretty soon from climate change. So I think this is an opportunity in this COVID moment and this economy needing help to think about this preparation. It's an opportunity I think we shouldn't miss. So I'm going to stop there and take your questions. I'm sorry I went a little longer than I had intended, but I get excited about water. But anyway, I'd love to hear your questions. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandra. I'm going to start with a two-part question, if I may. I think especially the second part is rather overarching in its scope. But the first I might call the elephant in the room question. And that is, do you see water management as both a physical but also a political challenge? For example, a big step taken last year by the current administration was to roll back the 2015 Waters of the U.S. rule, which was intended to clarify which waters fall under the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. According to an NPR report, and I'm quoting, developers, mining companies, and farmers painted the regulation as a massive federal overreach, while environmental groups argued that wider protections are needed to protect the nation's complicated water systems from pollution. So the question is, what do you see as the consequences of this rollback? And is this indicative of the kind of back and forth that often occurs between successive administrations?
Yeah, thank you, Walt. That's a really important question. I appreciate that. Let me just say right off the bat that the Clean Water Act of 1972 was a really landmark piece of legislation for this country. The goal of the law, it's stated in the law that the intention is to protect and maintain the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. Okay, so that's the goal. And so the Clean Water Act was implemented to do that, largely pollution control, right? But there began to be some uncertainty about which waters in this country were covered under the act. Were all wetlands covered? Were the little tributaries? What was covered and what wasn't? And some confusion was created with some Supreme Court cases back in the mid 2000s, so 2005-06, that this 2015 Waters of the U.S. rule was trying to clarify. And it attempted to do that by sketching out laying out in quite clear terms what waters are covered by the Clean Water Act. You have perennial rivers, you've got intermittent streams, you have seasonal streams, you have wetlands. And so I do not think at all that there was overreach in this 2015 rule, which occurred during the Obama administration. It clarified what waters are covered. I think the waters that had been covered before, compared with it increased those by maybe 5 to 15%, I believe, is the numbers I've seen. And so it really helped us to understand how to move forward and protect under the Clean Water Act. What's become known as the Trump rule, the waters of the U.S. rule implemented under the Trump administration, have really set us back because many headwater streams, many intermittent streams, which are particularly important in the West. I mean, I live in the Rio Grande Valley, and most of the tributaries coming in are intermittent seasonal headwater streams. And as well as about half of the remaining wetlands in the country would not be covered under this rewrite of the rule. So there was a repeal and a new rule put in place that really pulls back the protections of our rivers and tributaries and wetlands in the country. So not surprisingly, it's been taken to court. It's now in court. So there'll be some, delay in understanding how this is going to play out. So I would just say stay tuned. But at the moment, there's a risk to the continuing protection of our fresh water.
So the second part of my question is as follows. There was a 2017 report by the Congressional Research Service, which I perused and found out that there are 8 cabinet-level federal departments and 21 subsidiary administrations and services that are tasked with various freshwater issues. From your experience working with many of them, do you see them as the key to solving the water issue, or are they, because of the complicated and diverse and disparate nature of these various agencies and their tasks, do you see that as part of the problem? Or put another way, is there a better way for the government to be involved in water management?
That could take another hour. I have to be careful about not going off on this one. But if you look at how water is managed in this country, it is kind of confusing. Most water quality is managed by federal agencies. Water supply tends to be managed at the state level. So right there you have some conflict. And yet you have the Bureau of Reclamation building and managing the big dams, right? And so you've got this, you've got this interlinking set of authorities in how you're managing water. And we have no Office of Water for the country, right? You have irrigation water being managed as a combination of, U.S. Department of Agriculture and Bureau of Reclamation. You have, again, water quality being managed largely by the Environmental Protection Agency. So you have, it can be very confusing. I think if you implement the laws that we have well, our waters could be pretty well protected. I think the enforcement of the laws we have is extremely important. And more, I guess, cooperation and intersyncing of goals among the agencies is really important. But I think just, making sure we don't backtrack on the protections we have is super important. And we've been seeing that in recent years.
Great. I'd like to now get down to something that's near and dear to many of our viewers this evening. There is what's called the law of prior appropriation, or the first in time of use rule for water rights, and the 7-state Colorado River Compact governs much of the water use in the Southwest U.S. What problems and/or solutions do you see as the Colorado River flow continues to decrease in an extended drought? And are there increased water calls from downstream states? And in this context, what is the status of the renegotiation of the Colorado River Compact?
Another big question. Very, very good question. Very complicated question. So, as I'm sure most of you listening tonight know, the Colorado Compact was developed after a very wet period in the 20th century. The 1920s were an unusually wet time. And so the compact that was written to divvy up the water among the states assumed there was a lot more water in the system than is typically the case. And now we're moving into a period where we have climate impacts already showing up. And the climate scientists tell us that by the middle of this century, the Colorado River as a whole is likely to have 20% less water in it, 35% less water in it by the end of the century. And those are kind of conservative. It could be more than that. So we have a system that's already over allocated, and the amount of water is going to decrease. And I want to quickly add that the Native American tribes that are in the Colorado River Basin, I believe there are 29 of them, have very senior water rights as a result of a Supreme Court case that basically established that Native American tribes have what is called reserved water rights, that their water rights were assumed to be there and go back to the date that the reservations were established. So they're often very senior rights, and yet those rights have not yet been allocated. I believe they might add up to something like 2.8 million acre feet of water, which is very close to what Arizona uses of the Colorado River. So there's a lot going on here that has to be worked out. And at the same time, we have Lake Mead and Lake Powell at about half or less of their capacity. So the states, and this is a very positive thing, the states have begun to cooperate and begin to develop solutions together. One of the first that was done was to set up let me get to the more recent one for the sake of time, something called the Drought Contingency Plan, which says, let's do our best to conserve and keep some water in Lake Mead. Don't take our full allocation, and keep some water in Lake Mead so that it doesn't drop so low that we have to have the federal government declare a shortage, which cuts off water to Arizona and a little bit more to Nevada. And so they're working together to try to do these things, right? Whether it will be enough, we have to see. There is some confusion still about when a compact call from the lower basin to the upper basin, what are the conditions where that can happen, and what does that look like? There's still some uncertainty, I think, about that. But the good news is the cooperation has begun. We think about the old Mark Twain statement, at least it's attributed to Mark Twain, whether it's truly his or not, I don't know. Whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting over. But we're seeing cooperation now. And without that, I think we don't stand a chance to really solve these issues. So there's a lot of going on in water politics in the Colorado River Basin. Pay careful attention to it. The upper basin has not yet fully made use of its allocations. The southern part is making use of its allocation, obviously the lower basin. And then 10% goes to Mexico. And of course, nothing has been established for the river itself. So any hope to, restore flows to rivers and the Delta is extremely difficult. So I hate to be, sort of not terribly, the promising thing is the cooperation. The difficult thing is the physics of water and the physics of how much water is going to come into this basin with climate change. So I guess stay tuned on this too. There's going to be a lot happening.
Okay. So I'd like to switch gears a bit and go to what is the most popular question among our audience. And it's something you do address in your book. But what do you see as desalination of seawater as a possible solution to our water problem?
Good question, and it's one that often comes up. And desalination, the removing of salt from seawater, so you make that water fresh enough to drink, is a very viable technology. It is a growth industry. If you look at the growth, it is going up. But still, it is only going to solve a small share of the problem. And the reason is that it is very expensive. It takes a lot of energy to remove salt from water. Most of it is done now through reverse osmosis, where you push water through a membrane and the salts stay behind and the fresh water comes out the other side. But it takes a lot of energy to do that. And so there's almost no opportunity to think about growing crops with water that's desalinated. And yet agriculture accounts for 80 to 85% of the water consumed in the Western United States. So, and you have to move that water then. You might find desalination to be, a useful solution for a coastal city like San Diego, and there is a desalination plant just north of San Diego in Carlsbad. But to move that water inland is very expensive, and the desalination process itself is very expensive. And it's energy intensive, right? So in a way, we're contributing to climate change to solve some of climate change problems. It's not the most elegant solution. So really, and maybe I didn't emphasize this enough, there's still so much conservation and so much more water efficiency we can get out of our existing technologies, new technologies, and marrying information technology with efficiency technology, that I don't think we need to look at desalination in that silver bullet solution kind of way that we do. There's so much more conservation we can do. We're seeing soil sensors and information technology being married to these efficiency technologies, allowing farmers to know just how much water they need to apply to their crops and not using more water than they need, and so there's just a lot we can do with getting smarter about how we use water. And that's really, I think, the direction that a sustainable water future needs to go.
So we also have a sister question to the last one, and your answer may or may not be similar to what you just told us. But do you think it's feasible to create a pipeline or some kind of diversionary system that would move floodwaters from the Mississippi to the arid Southwest?
Solutions like this have been looked at for quite some time. And there's talk about taking water from the Great Lakes and bringing that to the Southwest, loading up ships in the Great Lakes and sending that water to China and so on. These have been around for a long time. And again, the problem is energy and cost, not to mention the ecological damage of doing this, but just the economics and the amount of energy it would take, they really don't make sense. The water would become so expensive when it got to its destination. Who could afford to grow a crop with that? And again, there's so much more cost-effective ways we can get smarter about using water. Every city in the West has seen its per capita water use come down because of those water efficiency standards that I mentioned. I live close to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Albuquerque has a plan for the next century that says it requires no additional water rights to meet it, no additional water to meet it, right? Just water recycling, water reuse, conservation, watershed management, those things will be sufficient to meet the needs of this major city in New Mexico for a century, even taking climate change into account. So I think it's, again, that getting back to that Einstein slide, it's that mindset shift. We want to go out and look for more water. That's what we sort of have done for the whole 20th century. But really, the new stuff is exciting. How do we get more efficient? How do we think about the demands we place on our water systems, right? Our diets. We can make some personal choices that influence this. So there's a lot we can do, to get smarter about how we use water and build water security in these new ways. And I think it's really exciting, and it involves a lot of new thinking and a lot of new technology at the same time.
And another, again, related question, but not surprisingly, at the time of the UN Water Conference in 1977, when, by the way, our global population was about 4 billion people, Gilbert White, the prominent American geographer who's some have called the father of floodplain management, said that globally there was not a freshwater shortage, but rather it was a question of distribution. Do you think that still is the issue today, with a population in the globe just approaching 8 billion and very much projected to increase in the coming decades?
Yeah, water, when you think about water, nature has dealt a really tough hand. In order to grow crops, you need a lot of sunshine. And by definition, you're not going to have as much rain where you have a lot of sunshine. And so that's been a big part of the reason for moving water around. The one thing I think we need to remember is that there's still hundreds of millions of people, at last count that I've seen, maybe close to 800 million people, who still don't have access to safe drinking water. Something most of us, all of us, take for granted, every day. But the main reason they don't have safe drinking water is not because the water's not there. It's not a shortage problem. It's that access hasn't been provided. The wells, the pumps haven't been put in place to provide that safe drinking water. So that's a solvable problem. It's more of a problem of poverty than it is of water, right? So when we talk about, the water crisis of people not having water, that's an access problem more than it is a water shortage problem. And it's one we can solve by dealing with poverty and dealing with providing that access. But yes, we have this kind of flip-flop situation where we have an intensification of droughts and an intensification of floods happening. I think it's still the case today, it was a few days ago, that a quarter of Bangladesh was underwater. A quarter of the country was flooded. And that's the kind of thing that we're going to see. And so, being able to prepare for those kinds of disasters is really, really critical. 8 billion people is a harder number to provide food and water for than 4 billion. Do I think we could do that? Absolutely. 40% of the food we're producing is wasted. Right there, that's a big chunk of food production that we could capture. A lot of the water that's going into agriculture is growing crops for livestock, right? And so that's another area where we could tamp back and have more water for meeting the direct needs of more people. So it's going to take adjustment. It's going to take new policy, new priorities, new values around water, and again, some new ways of thinking about it. But I do believe that through smarter management, we could meet the water and food needs of 8 billion people.
We have time for one last question. And again, it's one that has this very strong local influence, but it actually is maybe a good, if you will, a good indicator for issues that other parts of the country have. And the question goes as follows. We have a grade A healthy river in the Yampa River, one of the great Western rivers that flows like it did a century ago before civilization changed things in the Yampa Valley. Now, this comes with its issues, especially at low base flows and post runoff. How do you see us keeping this river wild in a future where it is drier, hotter, and I might add more populated?
Yeah. It's a great question. I worry about these beautiful rivers. We just had a major feat in my state of New Mexico where, a challenge to the Gila River, which, like the Yampa, it does not have a dam on it on the New Mexico side. It's still flowing free on the New Mexico side. And there was a challenge to that, a desire to divert that water. And so far it's been squashed, and the free-flowing river of the Gila continues. And I would hope the same would be true for the Yampa. It takes a lot of grassroots organizing and protecting to make sure the values of the river that are important to the people of the valley get listened to. And this is where it gets tricky and hard. There's been a long history of a fraught relationship between farmers and ranchers and people more interested in the environmental benefits of rivers. And yet I think, coming together and discussing these smarter solutions can provide ways to have both. We saw that in the Verde River in that example that I showed, and it can be done, but it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of trust building. And it's not too early to start that. It's already started, of course. There's wonderful organizations working in the Yampa River. I know some of the people working there, and they're tremendous and committed and working hard to do it and building that trust. And so I think that's really, really key. Climate is a big wild card. How can we keep rivers flowing when the precipitation coming into them is beginning to decline? And I don't have a great answer for that. We're going to have to do the best we can to manage the land and manage the water as sensibly and as sound a way as we can, and keep them flowing as long as we can, given what nature is delivering under a climate future, a different climate future. So there's a lot of work ahead, and I appreciate that question. The Yampa is a beautiful river, and I truly hope it stays healthy and flows clean and strong for a long time.
Great. Sandra, in closing, I'd like to thank you for an extremely informative and thought-provoking seminar. Some have asked, is it available later on? Yes, it is. One can either go to the Crowdcast link or go to seminars@steamboat.org. And I also want to thank the audience for tuning in. And please consider making a contribution to help us continue bringing you seminars. And you can do this by hitting the green bar at the bottom of your screen. And I also want to be sure that you set aside time to tune in for next Monday's seminar by Kathleen Hall Jameson, a nationally recognized authority on political communication, campaigns, and political rhetoric. And she will discuss a very timely subject, cyber hacking and the 2020 election. So I wish you all a good night, and thank you for being with us. And thank you, Sandra.
Thank you very much. Good night.